Hello, I'm Clive Priddle, and I am joining you with a new edition of The Current, which will appear on April the 24th. And I'm delighted to welcome this time two experts on the subject of immigration in America. And we're going to be talking about how immigration and in fact, the life of immigrants is being affected under the era of coronavirus. So first we have Alina, author of No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants. She's a professor of law at New York University. And also here is Erika Lee, author of America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. And she is a Regents Professor of History at the University of Minnesota. I'm really thrilled that you both could join us. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you both a little bit about the past before we get right into the present. So I'm going to ask this of you first, Erika. So every pandemic has been accompanied by xenophobia. It seems that they go hand in glove. We were talking to Laura Spinney the other day about this, and she said, as far as she knew, every pandemic had been blamed on some community or other. Usually one that was distant from, as it were, the home community. Is that your experience in writing your book? Did you find that pandemics came up as a spur of xenophobia in American history?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, xenophobia has been a long part of America's tradition, intertwined with slavery and settler colonialism. There's always been a need and an impulse to other immigrants alongside other racialized minorities. But in particular, the ways in which the language of disease and immigration go hand in hand is really quite striking. So even in the absence of a public health crisis, immigrants have always been defined as an invasive species, as a plague. And then you sort of bring in the public health aspect of it, and immigrants then become carriers of disease, carriers of contagion, blamed for public health outbreaks because either they are biologically, carriers of certain viruses, or because of their allegedly unsanitary health conditions, living conditions, quality of life has led to breeding of various diseases. So they have always been vulnerable to that kind of language, even before you get bubonic plague in 1900 or polio in 1916 or Ebola in 2014.
And it's been the Italians, it's been the Jews, it's been any recent immigrant population has been blamed for a pandemic. Is that right?
Yep, 1793, Germans are blamed for bringing what was called the German flu. The Irish are blamed for cholera. So are Jewish immigrants. What makes this so timely a conversation right now is, of course, that Chinese immigrants in particular have always been particularly stigmatized as an immigrant group that is unsanitary. They eat weird things like rats and dogs and cats. They live in unsanitary conditions. Chinatowns have always been seen as places of disease and contagion that then will infect white America. So some of this rhetoric that we're seeing and hearing today, the Chinese flu, the Wuhan virus, these are not only part of the contemporary xenophobia that is the United States today. It's not only part of the rising tensions between the US and China. It has really deep, long, historic roots that have always identified Chinese people, Chinese spaces, Chinatowns as particularly unhealthy.
So how, if you can generalize, how are Asian American communities in America feeling right now? How are they responding to this?
It's frightening. It's absolutely frightening. We've seen the number of hate crimes being reported, and of course, we know that the vast numbers go unreported. We see them rising in the past few weeks. The last 2 weeks of March, there were close to 1,000 that were being reported to community organizations. Before that, we had seen a lot of postings on social media of various different communities, not only in the US, but globally, of acts of discrimination, people being spit upon, being yelled at, a very well-publicized incident of a woman in Brooklyn who was attacked with what was believed to be acid. This is at the extreme of really violent acts. What we don't often hear about is just this undercurrent of fear that many Asian Americans, and not just Chinese Americans, this is one of the ways in which xenophobia and racism works for Asian Americans, is that, I'm in Minnesota, and many of the victims of these hate crimes are not Chinese American. They are Hmong American. They are Southeast Asian descent. But we are all lumped together as carriers of this virus, and there's just a huge undercurrent of fear of going grocery shopping. And now that the CDC has recommended that we all wear masks, an Asian person in a mask sends a really different visual message than a non-Asian person in a medical mask. And this is just one other example of the new normal that we're in. But the point is, it has a really long, deep history as well.
So again, I'm generalizing, of course, but my understanding is that the Asian American community broadly is probably economically more robust than other immigrant communities in the country. And I'm going to switch here across to Alina and maybe ask you if your experience as a New Yorker dealing with all the many immigrant communities that we have in the city here, if you're finding that one particular challenge is the poor, and among the poor, those who are poor or stateless or legally uncertain as to their status. How are they managing, and what's their experience right now?
Well, right now, it's essentially the policy of our federal government to allow some of us, some members of the public, to suffer the worst burdens of this disease. And we see that very much so with immigrants, particularly those who are undocumented, who don't have status, who have been thus far cut out from the vast majority of the safety nets that our government has been providing in somewhat greater measure these days in light of the pandemic. And I think this really highlights a problem with the way the US policies around public health and public safety have really cut out immigrant members of the public. And I see this in New York City every day. I have clients and colleagues and friends who have been working for justice around workers' rights, immigrant rights in the criminal legal system, who have noted over time the way that status has always created an opportunity for a double punishment for people who are still, longtime residents of our communities. And COVID-19 has only made this worse. I have clients of mine, I'm an attorney, and I represent people who face deportation. And I have clients of mine who right now are sitting in jails facing civil immigration charges. Constitutionally, they are not allowed to be punished for their lack of status. And yet they're sitting in jails where the rate of COVID-19 has increased exponentially, far greater than even in New York City, which is the epicenter for the disease here in the United States. And so our government has chosen, they have the choice to release all of these individuals, but they've chosen not to do so, to allow more than 30,000 people to sit in these jails, to allow millions of immigrants living in this country who don't have status to suffer without benefits, even while at the same time they're classifying many of these individuals as essential workers, people who are doing work every day to ensure that we are still, having a robust food supply, that people of wealth are still able to live their lives as comfortably as possible. And so all of the fault lines in our country that we've seen for a long time, I think, are just becoming more exposed with the way that the United States continues to criminalize immigrants, even during a pandemic.
I thought there was a very interesting op-ed by my local congressman, who's Adriano Espaillat, who represents Northern Manhattan. He's a Dominican. He's very sensitive to the Latina community here in New York. And the op-ed was essentially arguing that not all quarantine experiences are created equal, folks, precisely because if you're affluent and you can order your food out and you can work on your laptop, then quarantine is a very manageable experience for you. But if you are an essential worker and your job is to deliver that food, or if you have to take one of those jobs because that is the only job you can get in order to put food on your own table, then your experience of quarantine is utterly different. And quarantine, which is supposed to be the big social equalizer, actually turns out often isn't, especially for immigrant families, I think.
Absolutely. And America is really made up of millions of mixed status families. So this is an issue that's affecting people of all different statuses. I represent somebody whose wife and child are U.S. citizens, born and raised here in New York City. The wife is somebody who is an essential worker. She is working in the food industry. She's putting food into the hands and mouths of her fellow New Yorkers, and she has to work because she has been forced to support her family basically as a single parent, because ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has been detaining her husband for more than 2 years and continues to do so even now. There were moments where she would reach out and say that she was worried that she was getting symptoms of COVID-19, but she didn't know what to do because if she stopped working, there was no one to support her daughter. And she would be worried about calls she was getting from her husband in jail, who would talk about, men, just a few feet away from him, who would be coughing and showing signs and asking for medical attention, but not receiving it. And so this is an individual who is being targeted because of his status. He's locked up for that reason alone, the government refuses to release him, even as his wife, a U.S. citizen, is on the outside and also suffering as somebody who has to work in order to survive and is doing this work in order to allow other people in New York to have better lives. And I think that kind of suffering, and I should also note that this is a Black family, African-American woman, a Black immigrant husband, and a child that they're raising in the Bronx. They're the ones who are suffering the most on multiple different levels because of U.S. governmental policies. And immigration issues are not just issues that affect people who don't have status or may not yet be U.S. citizens. They affect everyone in this country. And it's really tearing at the fabric of our community. We feel it very much here in New York City, given how many people are immigrants, how many people live in household, family member is an immigrant. But it's certainly true across the country. And this is an issue that American families care very deeply about.
I have been struck more than once. I'm a Brit, as you can tell, so I technically am an immigrant here too, although a rather unusual one perhaps. But the British Prime Minister, one of the more high-profile sufferers of coronavirus, and he seems to have been kept alive by a New Zealander and a Portuguese. And I hope that people remember that, and I hope he remembers that when he's back to his blustering best, which I'm sure he will be before too long. Do you think that there are long-term consequences of the virus for immigrant communities here? Will there be sort of structural changes? I'm going to throw this one first to you, Erika. Do you think that this prejudice against Asian Americans, or particularly against Chinese Americans, is going to endure in a different way that perhaps it would have done otherwise?
I think so. And I think that's just one of the probable long-term consequences. I think actually one of the things that I'm sure Alina has a lot to say about as well is that in terms of immigrant communities and immigration, one of the biggest long-term consequences, I think, is essentially the end of immigration as we know it. This is not just something that is part of the pandemic. Of course, we've been living through what I, as a historian, would identify as the highest and most institutionalized period of xenophobia in our history, with all of the various Trump administration immigration laws essentially ending refugee resettlement, drastically reducing and ending asylum, let alone the backlogs on visas and et cetera. But with the pandemic, I think there are many who are looking at the ways in which the administration has been using the public health crisis that we're in to go even further. And I am greatly concerned that that reopening our borders is going to be one of the last things that we end up doing in this current administration.
I agree with what Erika is saying. I think the Trump administration in particular has essentially used every opportunity as a power grab in terms of his openly xenophobic and racist immigration policies. And I'm sure that he will cling to these opportunities. The fact that he chose to, essentially shut down borders, that Customs and Border Protection have been sending even children back and not accepting people who are applying for asylum in this country. It's a travesty and an injustice, and sadly not a surprise for those of us who've been watching the Trump administration closely. I will say, however, that there is also a growing recognition among some people in the United States that the need for a much more thoughtful approach to what we consider public health and public safety, what we value and prioritize. I think that there is a growing recognition that we are far more connected than perhaps people thought. And even though it is certainly the case that COVID-19 is being felt, the burdens are being carried much more heavily by those who have always carried the heaviest burdens in our society. There may be an opportunity, depending on how the election goes, for people to much more seriously consider real restructuring of immigration policies and systems to prevent these kinds of travesties from happening again, to not make it so easy for an administration to shut down asylum policy unilaterally, to not make it so easy for people to be locked up in jails and prisons, dying for purposes of a civil immigration law. I think there are questions that people are asking that they weren't necessarily asking 4 years ago or 8 years ago. And depending on how we answer those questions, I think this could be a learning moment for the country.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because if Trump is re-elected, then one can assume that nothing changes. So let's talk about the other eventuality, that there's a change in the administration. The last Democratic president, also a lot of people, fairly aggressively. In fact, I think one of the reasons that Trump was able to do what he did initially was because it was already in part being done. You know, some of the logical groundwork was in place. So apart from voting against Donald Trump, how do we hold the next administration to a different standard when it comes to understanding, appreciating, supporting, integrating people who want to live in this country, which people have always expected and been entitled to expect?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's really been only one playbook the last 30, 40 years, which is what I call the good versus bad immigrant myth. The idea that there are some good immigrants and they deserve a path to citizenship, and there are bad immigrants and they deserve deportation and to be blocked from coming to the country. and that the problem with Trump is that his category of bad immigrants is really big, and we just need to shift the line back over to where it was, for example, under the Obama administration, and everything will be fine. But as you noted, under the Obama administration, which also adopted a good versus bad line amongst immigrants, deported 3 million people, record-breaking numbers of forcible deportations from an administration that really grew the deportation machinery and handed it over to the Trump administration, which then decided to use it even more extensively. But it's true that machinery was there and that mindset was there. And so if we really want to break out of that mold, to try something new, we have to stop thinking it's a good idea to divide up our communities into who's deserving and not, and to turn our attention to the actual structures that we put in place and the harms that things like a vast deportation and detention machinery create for the entire country. And so it becomes less about who deserves to stay or go, and more about what we as a country, whether we even deserve to do this to people who have been living and working here, people who are coming to enter our borders in order to build a better life. And a lot of the structures have to be reconsidered fundamentally, probably starting with the agencies. Many of the agencies got from being part of the Department of Homeland Security. Certainly, as I'm sure Erika will say, these are just new versions of agencies that have been around for a long time, but certainly putting them under the banner of Homeland Security, essentially claiming that these agencies are fighting crime, protecting the public, when what they're doing is rounding up neighbors, coworkers, mothers and fathers, and children and families into jails. I think we can start by looking at those agencies and really trying to reformulate our plans so that we have immigration agencies that are actually here to support communities that want to grow and thrive here, as opposed to constantly dividing us into those who deserve to be here and not.
I'd love to just add a little bit to that question as well, because I agree with everything that Alina has said. I do, and I do worry. So I've got this pessimist and optimist on each one on each shoulder, and the optimist is looking at our current situation and all of the talk around our economy, around our healthcare system, around our society, our neighborhoods is all about the world is going to be fundamentally changed, and we don't know what it's going to look like, but there are opportunities to drastically restructure. And I hope that immigration, it has to be, part of that conversation. But already I see the reassertion of the good-bad dichotomy, and I worry about how extreme we've gotten in our immigration policies. So, for example, on the one hand, we now know, as if we didn't know it before, how essential immigrants are in healthcare and in producing our food, in making sure that food gets to families as grocery store workers. We now can put them into the essential category. That is could be, right, become another category of the good immigrant. The other thing I worry about is, again, if we do vote Trump out of office, we now know that is probably going to be Biden. And, and just going back to the recent history under the Obama administration, I do not have high hopes that we will even get back to the more moderate immigration reform that was the signature of the Obama administration and the Bush administration. And, given how far extreme we are right now, I worry that the reformers, and we've seen this in the past, that the reformers will be happy enough to move just even incrementally back to the center, or best case scenario perhaps is that moderate comprehensive immigration reform package that many of us felt was extremely problematic. To go farther I hope that there's the opportunity. I hope that we do take this as an opportunity to restructure our immigration laws and agencies. I just know that as a historian, even when we've hit a peak of empathy and civil rights reform and goodwill towards abolishing discriminatory systems, it's never gone far enough. And in many ways, it's even reinscribed inequality and immigration just under a different name, under a different mechanism, and often obscured. So I hope, I hope, I hope, but I'm just not sure.
So you don't think that I was wondering whether the harvest season was going to make a difference to how people thought about this. If we started not seeing fruit and vegetables on our table because nobody could pick them in California, what is it that changes people's mind about this? How do people shift?
Well, I would say that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say that I think what we have seen progress from is really the collective action of people who are directly impacted by this xenophobic and dangerous decision-making from the Trump administration and past administrations. And so we did see, for example, under the Obama administration, as the numbers of people facing deportation skyrocketed, that youth were really on the ground, organizing, fighting, trying to push forward true reform. There's obviously a lot more that could be unpacked there in terms of what it means to be pushing forward for reforms aimed at young people who came here as children versus broader reforms. And those are questions that I think activists really grappled with at the time. They made their choices, they pushed hard, and that is the reason why President Obama, towards the end of his administration, started making changes. Obviously, at the beginning of his second term, or towards the end of his second term, towards the end of his first term, coming up with deferred action for childhood arrivals, the program that provided temporary reprieves for young people who came here as children, and then trying to expand that towards the end of his second term in office. Again, that is not the dream. It's not what people want for immigrants, just a temporary reprieve from deportation, but it is a partial victory that was gotten only because people organized and they pushed instead of patting themselves on the back and saying, oh, look, here we've elected a president who's going to push for us. They knew that wasn't enough. And of course, now we're looking at towards the end of this administration, or at least hopefully the end of this administration, but perhaps the end of just the first term, as the Supreme Court is deciding what to do with all of these individuals who've had deferred action status, many of whom are healthcare workers and people in the field providing for this country. And knowing that group of people, their limited protections may be eliminated. I think those are the kinds of things that, again, could push major collective action. For farm workers, farm workers have been organizing for a long time, and they are trying to push through this, given somewhat of a spotlight now, given the concerns that they are both essential workers, yet cut out from some very basic labor protections, immigrant rights, and other protections that should be in our laws. So if we see the people who are being directly impacted at the intersection of farm work and immigration, healthcare work and immigration, education and immigration, we see those folks really on the ground, we support their organizing. I think that's the way we see change happening, regardless of the administration. Even in a Trump administration, we can't give up and cede the ground entirely. There are key victories that people have managed to achieve over the last 4 years, and it's only because of organizing and folks being willing to stand up and say, no, this is against our laws, it's against our Constitution, and it's against our moral principles.
I would agree with that. I think, again, looking at the long historical record, what does give me hope for change is seeing how, when I've gone out and participated in various protests, it's not just that one community that is targeted. It's a broad range of people who have come together across racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, interfaith coalitions. And I know that from the historical record, when Chinese immigrants were barred, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, when Mexican and Mexican Americans were deported, there were very few protests, and the vast majority of the public response was just utter silence. So this is something new, this collective action. I think more people are much more aware of discriminatory immigration policies than ever before. And I think that they are more active in protesting them. So that is something that has to continue regardless, as Alina said, whoever is in the White House.
It does feel to me, I mean, I was thinking about the very difficult to generalize out of publishing trends, because publishing is such a sort of strange industry. But you know, one of the reasons we're here is because we're celebrating both your books. I think it's fantastic that we have both your books on our list. Very proud of them. But I also think there's much more interest in different voices from different communities now in, for example, the sort of literary fiction area. You feel there's more diversity. I think it's creeping into even the narrative nonfiction, where, you know, 10 years ago it all used to feel like it was biographies of white men. And now it just doesn't feel as though that market is present anymore, that people are interested in something else. So my last question to both of you, as distinguished professors at very prestigious universities at New York and Minnesota, what are you getting from your students? Is there hope to be found in where the students' heads are? Where are their interests? Where are their interests broadly, culturally, in the world and in different groups of people? Where do you think their hearts and souls are when it comes to the issue of immigration in America?
Well, I work with law students, and it's been a very interesting arc over the last few years. I remember being at the law school when the election results were announced, and being in town halls with law students who seriously questioned if going to law school was the right thing. They were questioning everything about what they believed, and this is being a professor at a relatively progressive institution and community in New York City, of people who really, were hoping that they could enter the legal profession to change the world, and they questioned that when President Trump was elected. I saw that shift then when the Muslim ban, the first iteration, was announced within days of Trump's inauguration, and we rushed to the airports, and we were there on our laptops, and we were outside the airports protesting. As somebody who was inside the airport with family members who were wondering if their loved ones would actually be, allowed to come into the United States from these holding rooms at JFK, I know all of that mattered. Not just the legal work, not just the protests, not just the elected officials who were coming in. All of it together mattered. And our law students saw that. They saw the way the law worked. Now, of course, all of these things eventually ended up in the Supreme Court. And that might be a separate conversation about, where the law goes and what the backstops really are to protect our constitutional rights, given the intersection of politics and the Supreme Court at this moment. But the work of lawyers, really following the lead of groups that are organizing and pushing back against the xenophobia, really made a difference, and students saw that. But, over time, with some bad Supreme Court decisions, with more and more policies coming out from the Trump administration every day, people are questioning it again. And I think that's okay. I think law students are now seeing that the tool of the law is just one among many tools in the immigration space. Immigration law has been far more oppressive than it has ever been helpful to immigrants. And our job as lawyers is to take the law back for the people and try and use it as a tool to dismantle systems. And that is something that I think law students are seeing more. And I'm sure this next election will really dictate trajectories for many of them to come. Some will probably leave the profession depending on what happens while others will be recommitted to it?
I teach mostly first-generation immigrant and refugee undergraduate students, and I remember how devastating the 2008-2009 recession was for them. I teach at a land-grant public university. Many of my students already work full-time or part-time in addition to going to school. So I am really worried about them, as I am about all of this next generation that is either going to school or graduating into this particular recession. But for my immigrant and refugee students in particular, I mean, one of the reasons why I wrote this book in particular is because, again, like Alina, the 2016 elections was really a wake-up call for many of us who thought we knew how this worked and thought we knew, in my case, the history of both welcoming immigrants and shutting them out. And for my students, they greeted me the next day after the election with just an outpouring of fear of being deported themselves, fear of being separated from their families, many of whom had been waiting for years in refugee camps, and also being fear of being victims of hate crimes. I just don't know. I really am concerned about them simply being able to continue their education. I don't think the fear has let up in the past few years. I think they're at an earlier stage in their education than the law students that Alina teaches. I know, to get back to your earlier question, they really do, support and are passionate about diverse voices and literature and nonfiction, but quite frankly, they're really at the stage of simply surviving right now, and I'm just really concerned about them.
Well, it's a pretty sobering note to leave on, but I really want to thank you both for helping us understand this in perhaps more ways than we would have been able to on our own. And I truly believe that people who listen to this conversation will be much more motivated to do what they can to help. I often think at the end of these that what we really need is a kind of recommendation for what you can do. What can you do most if you want to alleviate the condition of the vulnerable, given that they are very vulnerable right now. Thank you very much. It was really great and really appreciate it. And thank you again for your books. And it's been a privilege to support them both.
Thank you so much for doing this in such a innovative way during these really challenging times.
Hachette,